So the next part is the according to. Kip has a kind of a long argument about.
Maybe this is a good place to bring up a specific point, which I feel affects a lot of Carrier's work, which is quite troubling, and that's his idea of what this phrase even means that Paul will use quite frequently. According to the scriptures.
Well, okay, let's pause. Let's pause for a minute so that we don't get distracted. Mm-hmm. Everybody take note that Kip Davis said that Paul uses according to the scriptures frequently. I'm very susceptible to gaslighting, apparently, because I was like, I'm sure that's not true, but why would Kip Davis say that unless it was? Like, am I missing something? Did I forget something? So I literally scoured the Greek text of the New Testament. This is false. Paul never, ever uses that phrase except one time when he's quoting the Corinthian Creed. Now, it appears multiple times in that creed, but it's generally widely agreed in the field that Paul is quoting a creed that sort of circulated. He didn't write the creed, so he's quoting someone else. It's not Paul. And that's the only place, right, that he uses the phrase katagraphos, which is, or katatasgraphos, either way, which is according to the scriptures. Nowhere else in the letters of Paul, 0 places does Paul use that phrase. So Kip Davis immediately misinformed the public by saying that Paul uses it frequently. He does not. It's not even Pauline. Like it's not even a Pauline phrase. Like it's in the creed, which is not written by Paul. It's just quoted by Paul, but it's definitely not frequently used by Paul. That's the first problem. And it gets worse from here. So let's roll it.
And I feel like Carrier and often mythicists will see this phrase. They have an idea in their head of what it means right at the outset, just based on their straightforward reading of the text, just a plain reading of the text, and that's just not good enough, because it doesn't delve into a more specific understanding, a very deeply culturally informed understanding of what Paul is most likely getting at when he talks about knowing things according to the scriptures. It's a phrase that is not unique to Paul. It's something that he's inherited. It occurs a couple of times even in the Old Testament, in particular in the book of Chronicles. The writer talks about knowing things according to the law. It's used with great frequency, this particular phrase, as well as analogous phrases to it within and throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is really where we should be grounding ourselves in attempting to understand what Paul is what he's getting at when he's using this phrase. Significantly, when the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about knowing things from Scripture, they're talking about the ways in which the Old Testament or their Hebrew scriptures it came to confirm for them the validity and the special meaning of things that actually happened.
So there's multiple things wrong here. He's being slippery, so he's not giving examples, so we don't really know what the fuck he's talking about right now. If he's talking about the Pesherim, that's false. The Pesherim about the future, so they're always talking about like this scripture actually describes, or it is to be understood as referring to this thing. But that is not katatos graphos. It's not according to the scriptures. That is not the phrase, right? So that phrase, I don't know when he says the phrase is used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I don't know what he's talking about, because that's not in the Pesherim. The Pesherim do not use that phrase. If it's somewhere else, I don't know what he's referring to, like what specific example. If he's talking about a Greek text in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I very much doubt that he's even telling the truth. I would be shocked and surprised and amazed if there was a Greek text in the Dead Sea Scrolls that used katatos graphos. But anyway, he doesn't give any examples, so I can't check. So I don't know, right? Like he's gaslighting us again. So I don't know if what he's saying is relevant or true. So anyway, because I felt like I was being gaslighted, normally I wouldn't bother. I was pretty sure, like this is my field. I fucking know this shit. I was pretty sure what katatos graphos means, and based on precedents in Greek language, etc. But I checked. I went to the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae and I fucking checked. I searched every goddamn fucking example of katatos graphos or any combination thereof, checked everything. And there's only two kinds of references like that. One is quotations of Paul, so like later writers who quote Paul, and Paul, obviously, and other authors who use the phrase. And how do 100% of the other authors who use the phrase, how do you think they use the phrase kata
to denote a source?
Fucking yes. God motherfucking damn it. Yeah, it's never used, never, ever, ever, never, ever, ever, ever used to refer to fulfillment of the scriptures. Now, possibly in later Christian authors who are quoting Paul and reinterpreting Paul, etc., maybe in some of that later literature it is. I don't know. I didn't check because I didn't think that was relevant. But in terms of everything about up to, let's say, like the 3rd century outside Christianity and everything before Paul. And then therefore, the way that anybody who read Paul then would understand him and the way Paul would assume people would understand him. When you look at all of that evidence, it is absolutely clear, without doubt, without exception, that katatas graphos means source. It does not mean fulfillment. So that means that we learn this from the scriptures. That's what he's saying. Now, that's the argument that completely contradicts Kip Davis. It's worse than that because we have Paul himself telling us this. This is the thing that really is not. This is an example where, because no one corrects Kip during this, so clearly no one here knows what the fuck they're talking about. It's not even James McGrath. That means none of them have read my book. Kip Davis hasn't. James McGrath, fucking liar, claimed to read it. He doesn't know it because if he had read it, he would know that Paul literally said, we learn the gospel and charisma of Christ, of Jesus, from the scriptures. Now, that's not a verbatim quote, but it comes from Romans 16, verses 25 to 26. You can read it. It's unmistakable that Paul is citing scripture as a source for the gospel and for the charisma. I don't know what else to fucking say. And I don't know how they don't know this. They complain about me being incompetent. They're massively fucking incompetent. James McGrath, how could he, of all fucking people, not know Romans 16, verses 25 to 26? Like, I can't even understand this. Okay, then there's this. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yeah. So introduce this. So bring this up too. This is additional.
Right. So I've watched too much of Bart Ehrman. I know that he's talked about this before, like the names of the gospels that we have. And, it's the gospel according to Matthew, according to whoever. Well, so I looked in my Jesus Interrupted because I have, his books, but he says names are attached to the titles of the gospels, the gospel according to Matthew, but these titles are later additions to the gospels provided by editors and scribes to inform readers who the editors thought were the authorities behind the different versions. That the titles are not original to the gospels themselves should be clear upon some simple reflection. Whoever wrote Matthew did not call it the gospel according to Matthew. The persons who gave it that title are telling you, in their opinion, who wrote it, which would be the source.
Yes. And that's absolutely true. This is why this is a thing that gets miscommunicated in the public. There's a telephone game on this. And because I often get people asking me, like, is it true that the earliest manuscripts are anonymous? It's like, no, that isn't what scholars mean when they say that the Gospels were originally anonymous. All of the manuscripts we have come from the labeled edition, which was the Anti-Marcionite edition, in which someone assigned these labels. So we don't have any earlier manuscripts. So we can't even ask the question whether they said this or not. No, the argument that scholars pervasively throughout the field agree that the phrase kata, like kata and a name, like kata markon, which is according to Mark, the phrase itself is universally in Greek means source. It does not mean author in the literal sense, right? So in any case, I for example, I found many examples in Galen. Like this, we have a lot of writings of Galen, more than we have of most other authors in terms of word count. And Galen uses this phrase a lot, kata tas graphos, or kata and a name, or whatever. It's always according to as a source. He's always saying, like, this is how we learn from this source, this, or everybody, he'll say like, katas tas graphos, and he'll say like all. So like, all, according to all the writings, in others, according to everybody says this, right? So it's always a source aspect. And there are no other examples before the Gospels. There are no other examples in the entirety of ancient literature of any book ever having this title. So no one ever identified an author with kata. That is a weird, completely unique, strange thing that only the Gospels, someone did to the Gospels. And the point that's been argued is that they were all labeled at the same time because it's clear that no one started the trend and it got picked up. Like someone just labeled them all and then published. But yeah, what they're saying is that what Bart Ehrman says here is that someone is saying, we think this is the person who wrote this, or we think this is the source behind this, even if some other scribe or whatever wrote it. And so that's what they're saying. And that's a very unique and different thing. Usually if you identify authorship, it's in the genitive or it's some sort of explicit phrase that says authored by or something like that. So and this is just taken for granted. Like this is what experts know. I don't know how Kip Davis does not know this. This is something that if he's competent in this field, he should know this. But yeah, this is one other thread about how kata gets used to refer to source, not to fulfillment. I did notice that he did reference something he said, like according to the law. He threw a reference in there. I don't know if he realized that that's a counterexample to his argument. He's refuting himself with his own example. According to the law does not mean fulfillment, right? Like what does according to the law mean? Obeying the law, right? It means you're following the law. It doesn't mean a fulfillment of scripture. It doesn't mean a fulfillment of a prediction. It means that you're basically using that as your source for your ethics. So you say, this guy lives according to the law. You're saying that he's sourcing his behavior to the law, to the Bible or whatever. So that's actually a counterexample that actually refutes for Kip Davis's entire point, which just shows that he's bullshitting. He doesn't really fucking know what he's talking about. He's just rambling, basically. So no, yeah, they're absolutely not. Everything he says is false. Paul does not use this phrase frequently at all, much less to refer to the fulfillment of the Gospels. No one does. 0 people. Certainly before Paul, no one does. After, like I said, maybe there's some Christian later that you can find in the later Christian tradition who does. I don't know. But certainly not when Paul was writing. That was not how the phrase would ever have been understood. It would always have been understood as source. We know from the scriptures. And like I said, he himself says that's what he meant in Romans 16. So there's more evidence than that. I talk about it in my book, but obviously these guys have never fucking read it, so they don't know what the hell they're talking about.
So we got a little bit more of this according to section. I think we pretty thoroughly covered it, but we'll listen a little bit more to see if they say anything substantial.
Stuff that they were going through. There's a series of texts. People like to call them commentaries or pesharim, peshers, on the text of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which go through this this formulaic structure of interpreting text from the prophets, where they will cite a text from the prophet Habakkuk, and then they'll provide a meaning to it, and they'll say the interpretation of this text is this, or this scripture means this.
Sorry, that's correct. What he said is like the phrasing is more like what he just said is like the interpretation of this is, and then they'll give an interpretation. That is not katatas graphos. That is not according to the scriptures. There's no connection whatsoever. He's just telling us random facts that have nothing to do with what he was talking about before. I mean, it's important to know that like how the shell game, like he's done a little switch on you. Like this is like Penn and Teller. He's done a little Penn and Teller act where he's kind of like pretending that he's told you something that's significant, but he's switched terminology halfway through. And if you don't pay attention, you don't notice that he's just talking out of his ass at this point.
It's basically an expounding of this idea of it being according to the scriptures. And over again, throughout these texts, you come to discover that they're not just sitting down and reading literature and coming up with ideas within their head. No, it's very important to these people that they're applying what they're seeing in the text of scripture to the very real stuff that they're experiencing in their day-to-day life, stuff that's happening right now.
Remember when he said, like, I don't know, 15 minutes ago? When he said, no, they don't have to actually read this stuff. They're just illiterate and just listen and can figure it out. They can just figure it out, just memorize everything and figure it out. They can just create pesher in their mind. They don't. No, here he admits that they have to actually do it textually. They have to read the fucking text to write these commentaries and construct these commentaries and find all these allusions and connections and stuff. Yeah, obviously they had to be fucking literate to do it. Thanks, Kip Davis, for confirming my point from earlier that you tried to deny. But anyway. Can continue.
It's almost a way of history writing. Like these people aren't writing historiography, in the Greco-Roman sense that historiography exists, but they are absolutely communicating information about their own history, and this is how they do it.
Also, maybe I'm misunderstanding what Kip is saying here, but I feel like what he's saying is that, the Jews that were doing this, they couldn't come up with novel ideas. I don't know if maybe I just misheard it.
No, I didn't take that.
Okay.
I don't think he meant that if he said something like that.
Okay.
I think, I'm not going to try and interpret that, but I'm hearing it because I already know how the Pesherim work. So, and I'm assuming, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I shouldn't do this, but I'm assuming he knows what he's talking about when it comes to the Pesherim. And so I'm assuming that when he says things that agree with things that I already know about how the Pesherim work, that's what he means, right? And so what he's talking about is that they would look at the scriptures and they would come up with actually quite creative ways to understand the scriptures. I think he would agree if you ever asked him, completely radically creative ways to understand the scriptures. But what he's trying to argue is he was originally trying to argue that katatas graphos meant something, but he's completely gone off the rails and he's talking about a completely different phrase that has no relevance or similarity to katatas graphos. He's talking about the phrase in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is that the interpretation is as follows. And in that context, yeah, absolutely. What he's describing is correct, that they would read a text and they say the interpretation of this is that. And it'd be like, this text says there was a lion sitting on a hill. And the interpretation of that is that there was Antiochus, who is known as the lion, is therefore in charge of something. Like, I'm making that up, but I'm just saying, like, they would completely reinterpret what the text meant. And that's what they're doing. And they use a very fixed phrase, a very commonly used phrase, which is something like the interpretation is, and that's how they do it. But that is not katatas graphos. That katatas graphos is according to, and according to only means source in Greek or obedience, adherence. So like according to the law means you're following the law. Those are the only two meanings that are relevant to texts. And so for him to, he's somehow like, he's trying to shell game us into thinking that a completely different phrase in Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls informs us about a completely radically different phrase in Greek, as if he knows Greek well enough. Clearly he doesn't, because he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about with katatas graphos. He didn't check, clearly. This is another thing. He didn't fucking check. The whole article is about how it falls apart when you don't check. And here are these guys doing this shit, spewing bullshit, and they're not checking. And they're therefore verifying exactly the point of my article, is that this is what happens when you don't check, is that you spew these like wildly false, lines of bullshit that have nothing to do with reality. What happens when you check? You get a completely different result than this. That's the point of my article, and they're just verifying it over and over again in this video.